Hello, everybody. It's Dagmar Moorside here from Schlafender Hase. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm the lead at Schlafender Hase for CPG and FMCG, and I'll be your host for the next 30 minutes. We've titled this session the FMCG Artwork Rabbit Hole, because if you manage packaging, you already know that one small issue has a way of pulling you deeper and deeper. So we're going to talk about why that happens and what teams that do this well, what they're doing differently. But let me start by introducing our guests. So I'm joined by Jan and I'm joined by Mike. Jan spent over 30 years at Unilever, multiple continents, and he essentially has the global marketing services lens. He's an expert in end-to-end packaging and product lifecycle management. Jan?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here. Lovely to be here. And yes, happy to share some of the insights, having led the artwork process in Unilever for more than a decade, building it from scratch through to a mature organization. So happy to be involved here and to share my insights. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Mike from Schlafender Hase, he's our Director of Product Management, and he has 25 plus years of building software for packaging, label, and artwork management. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dagmar. It's good to be here. I feel like I spend every day thinking about how I can close this gap between approved artwork and what actually ends up on the shelf. So this topic is very close to home for me. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sounds like it's going to be a great discussion. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to be talking about three components. And this is really the first of a series that we're producing here at Schlafender Hase, talking about artwork complexity. And so we'll touch upon it today and go a little bit deeper in the subsequent series. But we're talking about the real cost of getting it right. And this all comes down to your data, your recalls, your rework, and your reputation. Then we're looking at where they enter the process and what is the root cause of this complexity. And then we round that out with the definition of right first time, what that really looks like, scaling this process, and looking at recommendations around best practices in terms of tooling and technology enablement. We'll have a live Q&A at the end. So just to qualify who the session is for, I'm so glad that all of you have joined us live today, but certainly very much feel able to share this with your colleagues, your peers, anybody within the artwork space, whether they're coordinating their project management, your regulatory colleagues within R&D, your packaging, your QA, and then your marketing, the initiator who's creating initiating the artwork brief, and anybody who maybe sits at a regional level or a global level, and then your brand partners. This is also the lifeblood. It's really a collaboration. So we want everybody to really benefit from today. And so let's set the scene a little bit in terms of, think about your last product launch. So what actually happened when the artwork changed? When did compliance actually start, and who actually owns the label in your business? When were the claims finalized? Were there any hiccups? Were there any bottlenecks that happened? And then think about any external things that you had to consider in terms of your retailer adaptations. Did you have many to plan for? How many times a year are you doing this? Seasonal, pack sizes, etc. So that's the context that I want us to go into the session with, and as we start to talk a little bit more about this. So I'm going to give you a couple of stats before we start to go into some of the questions. So what research is showing is 46% of product recalls, they're driven by labeling errors. And oftentimes it's not necessarily just your adulterated or your undisclosed ingredients. It's minor errors that could have been caught during that process. And so what does that result in? We see when we're looking at 50% to 70% productivity loss because of manual checking. So we have established, or we do know within artwork, and it can be whatever size of organization you're at. But the second pair of eyes really doesn't scale when you're dealing with volume and more complex commercial as well as regulatory data that needs to go onto your packaging. And then that ultimate problem that we just talked about, one campaign becomes 15 retailer versions, and then that means 47 packaging variants. Each one of those present a possible opportunity for an error and just a lot of headache at the end of it. So let's get into it now, drawing on Jan. So Jan, I want to get your perspective from your time at Unilever, and other organizations. What is actually driving the packaging error problem in your perspective?
Well, I guess the simple truth, the simple reality is that artwork isn't simple, and it's in fact complex. And I'm very comfortable to say that from my experience in 30 years in Unilever, that it is probably the most complex process that the company has to undergo because of the number of people that are involved and the amount of information that needs to be correct on one single item. That single item, the pack, is not a creative output. It is a business critical data and content-rich vessel for communication that needs to meet external specifications. So you can't underestimate how complex it is to get all of that together. And as you've just illustrated, one small error, particularly in an environment in the US where you've got a lot of retailer demands of wanting unique packaging, the explosion of that and the multiplication of one small error can get out of hand very, very quickly. And all that data needs to flow not only to the pack for the consumer, but of course it's that information for the retailer to register the product. And then let's add to that, the error problem is you're dealing with high volume. In FMCG, you'll have tens of thousands of SKUs. You're busy. You've got lots of other things to do. You are under deadline pressure, and deadline pressure starts creating things like shortcuts and mistakes. There can often be unclear roles and responsibilities. Sometimes the process is ill-defined. But probably the most important thing is just to remember that we're humans, and humans are fallible, and humans make mistakes. If any of you have seen the breakdancing gorilla video on YouTube, you'll realize how your brain doesn't always do things right based on being distracted or cognitive bias. And for that reason, that's really where the errors come in. You're dealing with complex information, and it happens in a very short window, and we are fallible.
Yeah, 100%. That automated thing of filling in the gaps that our brain does. So were there some errors that were most common? No, not necessarily at Unilever, but from within artwork, whether that be sort of claims, can you take us through that?
So it obviously depends on which category you're in, which product. Of course, if you're selling bottled water, that's a very simple product, but you might be selling complex food products that are highly processed, therefore they've got a lot of ingredients. And if it's food, it generally will include allergens and declarations there. And then of course you're into a much higher risk, more difficult category. But if I could broadly cluster them into three, firstly, I would say it's anything that's related to ingredients. That's the most critical because ingredients relate to things like allergens and ingredients relate to things like claims. So those would normally be right at the top of the list of where you really got to get things right. Remember, if it's a product that you ingest, then it really gets into a critical area. One of the funniest, and actually it's not funny, of course, of the examples that I've seen is a pack of soup for chicken soup that contained chicken with a vegan claim on it. And you ask yourself, how does that happen? That should just be such a straightforward thing. Yet a number of people looked at it, saw it, and it all went through. So there you've got things wrong with claims and ingredients. The second one, which comes up quite often, is version control. It's remarkable that if you haven't got an organization that manages the files correctly, you end up working on the wrong artwork. And as FMCG, we often talk about SKUs, stock keeping units, but that's not the lowest factor. The lowest factor is consumer units. You will have a number of consumer units that are actually the same SKU. And if you're not working on the right file for that consumer unit, where you might have changed something because it's a different label material and therefore it has a different code, and you're working on the wrong file, you can get into trouble very, very quickly. And this, of course, is an area where people do shortcuts because, I'll just use the file at the printer. And you need to be sure that that's the latest file. And then the third one that comes up as a broad area of mistakes is, of course, as you try to simplify the number of SKUs in your business, you do localizations, you do multi-language, multi-country packs. And as soon as you get into that area, that gets complex because you're dealing with different languages. And I don't speak Spanish or Russian, and therefore the number of people that need to be involved to make sure you've got all the iterations in different languages and countries that meet the local regulations. Even simple things like just new codes that are needed for those pack. In a world where we can hardly remember the telephone number of our family members. That's how our brains have sort of deteriorated. So that's the order of it. And of course, the most damaging ones are the ones where you might have an ingest problem and it's an allergen problem and people are at risk of fatality. Those are dangers and damages and recalls to your brand that you can hardly recover from. So small errors can get big very, very quickly with multi-million price tags to it. And trust me, when you have that error, you don't get promoted, let alone keep your job. So you want to do your best to avoid those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good point. And Mike, can you weigh in on technology perspective?
And I was kind of smiling and nodding along there because what Ian's describing is exactly what we hear from people that are coming to us to try and get some help in this area. And I guess what we see, the root cause is that most of these big organizations have invested a lot of money in automated workflow systems, which help coordinate the artwork review and approval, or certainly the routing of the artwork. So between all the different teams, marketing, R&D, legal, etc. But the actual review bit itself, the part where somebody actually looks at the text, looks at the barcode, looks at the layout, that's still a manual process in most instances. So it's a big gap in this digital workflow, and it's where the errors slip through, as John said, about seeing what you want to see instead of what's actually being shown to you. We've seen some research from other industry partners of ours, like ESCO, for example, who put it very clearly. The approval process is inherently error prone. So you lose feedback, you get different versions, as Jan said, and if you're doing something with email-based reviews, then there's no single source of truth, but it's also a nightmare to keep track of anything like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like a lot of complexity. So we can see where it costs to get things wrong. And why don't we move on to the next and look at where errors are actually entering the process and what type of intervention is possible. So Mike, why don't you walk us through the typical artwork process? I know our audience is very familiar with this, but we can then speak about what that looks like in terms of risk mitigation.
Yeah, sure. So just as a bit of background, I guess, I've worked in and around the CPG, FMCG, artwork printing industry for pretty much my whole career. So very familiar with this. It's slightly different depending on the organization and their specific requirements, but broadly speaking, this is how it goes. So there are 4 main stages to it, and each one is a gate or a door. And of course, every time you open that, you are potentially letting an error come in with you. And the further down this workflow or this work stream that you catch these errors, the more expensive potentially is. So stage 1 is the brief. So some department, marketing, R&D, regulatory, each own a piece of this. The approved text lives somewhere with somebody. If that is at all ambiguous or incomplete at this stage, then everything downstream from there is just built on a really unstable foundation. Stage 2 is the artwork creation itself. So you're taking this content brief, giving it to a designer, a studio, or a print management agency. They're building their pack artwork based upon that. Very often manually copying and pasting text from spreadsheet, the Word document, sometimes even just retyping it in. Positioning claims that need to hit very specific size and placement requirements according to different regional guidelines and legislation, and inserting barcodes that could be for position only at this stage. Later on, of course, they need to be validated with the correct barcode. So a lot of manual steps in that stage alone, and as we just said, every manual step is a potential error point. Stage 3 is then the review and the approval cycle, and this is where really what we've seen is that teams lose the most time, especially if the source data hasn't been locked. So this research that we've seen and that we've done ourselves highlights that this classic pattern. For example, marketing makes an artwork change, regulatory then alters storage instructions or something along those lines that requires a new approval loop every time. If there's no version control, then the question, which file are we approving? You know, what am I working on? Becomes genuinely really hard to answer. And then the last and final stage is the pre-press and then the print release. This is where the file is made fit for print and goes to the printer itself. At this stage, the approval is done. So if there's an error now, that means total rework and potentially reprint if it's gone through all of that. A reprint is very costly, very time consuming, potential of out of stock on the shelf. So this is also where barcodes undergo a real kind of pixel level validation.
Yeah, definitely a lot. So Jan, I think we've talked through this whole process in quite a detail. Is there any, one or two words that you might have to add to that?
I fully agree with what Mike said. And just to reiterate, I think there are a couple of little things in those 4 steps that I think are crucial to bear in mind. In that content briefing, one of the most critical steps should be to have product design lock, early alignment on what it is, and then lock that design and then capture that content that needs to go on the pack. And of course, the ideal is you have a single source of truth brief that has all that information. Then building the artwork, stage 2, creating the artwork, that's a fairly simple process. It is, of course, a handoff. It normally would go to a PMA who would do it. And whenever you do a handoff and you pass a baton, there is a chance that you can drop the baton. But that's why the single source of truth is really critical for then checking that what has been briefed goes on the actual artwork, and there is a match between your single source of truth and the artwork. And this is where verification tools, pay for themselves infinitely, because it's just a good opportunity to ensure you've got a perfect match. Then approval cycles, of course, is where we'll come after, because that's the first time in the artwork process where all the elements come together on one single file. And that's where the human eye will take a second role as well, after you've done all that verification, to check that everything in its totality works by each of the individual owners of that info. Of course, if it's a Dove deodorant, for example, in Europe, is a 9 or 12 language pack. So you have a number of people that need to be involved to make sure all of that's correct. And then, as Mike said, once you've passed the approval stage, now the ball's rolling. And if that ball's rolling with an error, that ball gets pretty big and pretty expensive very, very quickly. So I would always caution people to make sure that they've locked their content. Don't change it on the fly. Sometimes it might change, and then you've got to have a process to manage that. But make sure you've locked your data correctly. Then it's easy to do a match, and using verification tools like that are valuable. And then finally, make sure that approval cycle happens, and you're 100% sure you get it right.
Yeah, good points. And let's just look into, before we get into some of the tools that you were talking about. I thought it's great to show a little area that you described. You talked about multiple languages and different areas, and so errors can really come from multiple sources. So that's very much what we see now, reflecting the complexity. Some of this is going to be regulated information, some of this is not regulated, some of it is optional. But and then you're also trying to storytell, and build through the creative, using that packaging as your marketing real estate, to your consumer. So lots of things to really consider. And then these 4 critical areas of risk. You mentioned the languages, but the allergen, I think you mentioned that earlier, right? In terms of the allergens and the risk, because it's life-threatening for consumers, and it's a real big liability. And then, of course, we've seen many examples of recalls or fines when we look at number 3, false marketing claims, because that can sound very good from a marketing perspective, but if it's a regulated type of claim, then that can really have some fallout, some consequences. So getting into, go ahead.
Just to repeat, and not to be alarmist, but if there is the risk of a consumer health or fatality, a young child were to die because they ingested a product because it wasn't correctly labeled, we can easily think of what that means. and why it's so important to do everything you can to catch errors before they go out into the market. It's a critical thing to have as a brand owner.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of leads us nicely into error detection. And this is one of the tooling. Well, obviously we're here from Schlafender Hase. We provide a TVT verification engine. So, in a nutshell, Mike, can you articulate what TVT does? I know there's a lot of things that it can do, but just in terms of highlighting how we can mitigate as a brand owner, as an artwork team, as an external partner, how we can use TVT to help mitigate some of those errors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the whole point of the tool is to remove the manual effort, and the manual effort is where the errors can creep in, of course. So when we see somebody using TVT, they're generally comparing the artwork files against the master content, whatever terminology you use for that, but the reference document source files. You're doing a side-by-side comparison. You're taking the PDF, highlighting the changes between the two, if there are any, doing barcodes, checking and grading, multilingual spell checking, you're doing the whole thing all in one go, in one verification cycle, rather than bouncing around between different tools. You're saving a lot of time doing it this way. You're literally doing these things in seconds or minutes compared to hours or days. And it's very easy to use this kind of solution, with one click. To do the comparison, then it finds every difference and every deviation in the text, the images, the barcodes, even the formatting and the style, the spell checking, as I said, and even critical words. So we would define a critical word as something like an allergen. That's, as you pointed out, that's super critical. So you need to be able to know if the allergens are there, know if they're correctly emphasized as per the regulations, without getting deep into the details. But it's far easier for a pre-programmed tool to do this than it is for a human being. As an example, one of our customers reduced their whole review process. They had a two-person review process cycle, and they literally halved it down to just one person. Another one eliminated really the incredibly high volume of manual proofreading they were doing, and really accelerated their speed to market through that whole approval process. So that there are real efficiency gains to be made with real business impacts, and that's exactly the gap that TVT was built to close. And I guess one last point that matters enormously in CPG and FMCG, as Ewan said, not to keep repeating it, but it's worth repeating. These allergen declarations that are present but incorrectly emphasized, or just not following the regulations, are going to cause a problem, and these can potentially be almost invisible to the naked eye. And this is why the use of some kind of automated tool like TVT is going to help catch it before it gets to print. We've also got, from a workflow perspective, we even built integrations into your most commonly used artwork management solutions, for example, ESCO's Web Center, so that it's really taking a whole load of manual work away from the user. There's no downloading and uploading files. Things just move seamlessly between the two solutions. They just talk to each other, they make it happen, and basically you can be assured that you're not going to get your file moving to the next stage in some kind of out of control process. It's always got a fully completed check against it.
Okay. Yeah, no, I can see how that could be very beneficial to organizations dealing with, a lot of products, a lot of SKUs. So we have about a minute for sort of the last section here before we go into the questions. But I think it's that, we spoke a lot about this. So here what we want to do is look at, Jan, let's start with the definition of right first time and how to scale that.
So very simply, right first time, and I'm sure most companies might be using that, is that the brief goes, the artwork is built, and then when it gets approved, it's approved the first time. Everything is correct, and you don't have to do it again. And here the simple maths are, if you've got 50,000 artwork, and you've got to do a second cycle, you're doing 100,000 artwork if you're not getting right first time. Imagine that waste of energy and time. The first time you do an artwork is great. A second time is a waste of time. So that's why that's important. A couple of things that I think are really the teams that get that right first time have in common. The first one is that they have early alignment and lock on the content and the data. Two is that they then structure that in one single source of truth, structured, governed document, so that the brief is straightforward and you're not dealing with an Excel file, a PowerPoint, an older artwork, and some text on an email. The third thing is that there is some automated verification. That, I think, is pretty much a no-brainer that makes sure that what I've briefed you is on the artwork. And then finally, there will, of course, be changes. Sometimes the regulations or something change in the middle of a process. So you've got to have a mechanism for if there are some changes or if there are some errors. And then finally, there needs to be an audit trail. That's, of course, you do the audit because you want to improve performance and speed, but it's also if it goes wrong. And if it goes wrong, it can go spectacularly wrong, and you need to learn from that. So teams that get that right, that's largely those 5 things that they keep in mind.
And are there any specific metrics in addition to sort of right first time that teams should really be striving for?
The top 3, I think, is 1 is right first time, because that's all about efficiency. 2 is about average duration. How long does it take you to improve an artwork? Because you want to do that quickly in FMCG. And then the third one is the number of ultimate cycles that you end up. Sometimes artwork can go through 6, 7, 8, 9 cycles. That seems highly inefficient. So those are the 3 top metrics that I would recommend for any organization. Right first time, average duration, and number of cycles.
Brilliant. Questions? My email is here. If you want to go ahead and connect with me on LinkedIn, and then please send us those questions that we didn't get to today. We can handle them offline. Apologies that we didn't cover them all today. The next series will make this a little bit longer by 15 minutes, so we have some more questions. Thank you very much, everybody. It was wonderful to have you. Thank you equally to Mike and to Jan for joining us today. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you. Take care now.